The pre-dawn darkness of October 27, 1943, hung thick over the Solomon Sea like a suffocating blanket. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes peered through his binoculars from the bridge of the destroyer USS Converse, watching the silhouettes of landing craft bobbing in the choppy waters ahead. In less than 2 hours, 8,000 New Zealand and American troops would storm ashore on Mono and Sterling Islands, the strategic specks of coral and jungle that the Japanese had transformed into fortified outposts. Hayes had seen enough Pacific battles to know that the calm before an amphibious assault was always deceptive. Behind him, the massive invasion fleet stretched across the horizon like a steel city on water. Transport ships loaded with the 3rd New Zealand Division and elements of the United States Marine Corps bobbed alongside destroyers, cruisers, and the precious landing craft that would carry the assault troops to their destiny. The Treasury Islands operation, codenamed Operation Good Time, represented more than just another stepping stone in the Allied advance toward Rabaul. These two small islands, situated strategically between Bougainville and the Russell Islands, controlled the southern approaches to the massive Japanese stronghold at Bougainville. Intelligence reports suggested that approximately 300 Japanese defenders had turned the islands into a maze of bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery positions, all connected by a network of tunnels that honeycombed the coral beneath the jungle floor. Major General Harold Barrowclough, commanding the 3rd New Zealand Division, had spent weeks studying aerial reconnaissance photographs of the target. The images revealed cleared fields of fire, carefully positioned defensive works, and what appeared to be a sophisticated early warning system designed to give the defenders maximum advantage against any seaborne assault. The Japanese commander, Captain Yoshiaki Ito, had clearly learned from the earlier Allied victories at Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. According to historical records documented in the official New Zealand military archives, the Treasury Islands had been under Japanese occupation since early 1942. When a small garrison had been established to monitor Allied shipping lanes and provide advance warning of any major offensive operations in the Central Solomons. The pre-invasion bombardment had been scheduled to begin at 400 hours, with 4 destroyers and 2 cruisers delivering a concentrated barrage designed to neutralize the most obvious defensive positions. But Hayes knew, as did every experienced Pacific veteran aboard the invasion fleet, that the Japanese had become masters at constructing bomb-proof shelters and camouflage positions that could survive even the heaviest naval gunfire. As the first faint traces of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, Hayes could make out the dark outlines of Mono and Sterling Islands rising from the sea, like prehistoric monsters. Mono, the larger of the 2 targets, stretched approximately 6 miles in length and varied from 1 to 2 miles in width. Its interior was dominated by dense tropical jungle broken by several small clearings that the Japanese had converted into landing strips and supply depots. Sterling, smaller and more heavily forested, sat like a sentinel guarding the northern approaches to its larger companion. The sound of ship engines echoed across the water as the invasion fleet maneuvered into final position. In the crowded holds of the transport ships, soldiers checked their weapons one final time, adjusted their equipment, and tried to ignore the butterflies dancing in their stomachs. Many of these men were combat veterans of earlier Pacific campaigns, but the Treasury Islands promised to be different. Intelligence suggested that the Japanese garrison had been reinforced with elite troops from the Special Naval Landing Forces, Marines who had sworn to fight to the death rather than surrender their positions. The first salvo erupted from the cruiser USS Montpelier at precisely 400 hours, sending tongues of orange flame stabbing through the darkness. The 16 6-inch guns spoke in unison, their shells screaming across the 6 miles of open water separating the bombardment force from Mono Island. Within seconds, the other ships joined the devastating chorus, transforming the peaceful dawn into a symphony of destruction that could be heard 50 miles away. Hayes watched through his binoculars as the first shells impacted along the suspected Japanese positions on Mono's southern shore. Massive geysers of coral, earth, and vegetation erupted skyward, illuminated by the flickering muzzle flashes of the Allied guns. The bombardment plan called for 45 minutes of intensive fire, concentrating on known defensive positions, suspected supply dumps, and the small airstrip that intelligence believed the Japanese were using to stage reconnaissance. Flights over Allied positions in the Russell Islands. On the transport ship USS President Jackson, Colonel John Robertson gathered his battalion commanders for a final briefing. As the naval gunfire thundered overhead, the 6th New Zealand Brigade would spearhead the assault on Mono Island, while the 8th Brigade prepared to land on Sterling once the first objective had been secured. Robertson had fought with the New Zealand Division in North Africa, where desert warfare had taught him the importance of speed and momentum in the opening phases of any attack. The Japanese response to the bombardment came sooner than expected. At 0 for 30 hours, mortar shells began falling among the offshore ships, indicating that the enemy had pre-registered their weapons on likely invasion routes. The destroyer USS Sigourney took a direct hit on her forward gun mount, killing 3 sailors and wounding 7 others. Despite the damage, her captain maintained position and continued firing at designated targets along the shoreline. As the bombardment reached its crescendo, the first wave of landing craft began their run toward the beaches. The Higgins boats, loaded with 36 men each, struggled through the heavy swells while their crews fought to maintain formation. Despite the increasing enemy fire, Sergeant Major William Thompson, a veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign, crouched in the bow of landing craft personnel large to 7 and watched the shoreline growing larger through the spray and smoke. The Japanese defenders had chosen their positions with deadly precision. As the first landing craft approached the reef line protecting Mono's southern beaches, machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions along the tree line. The distinctive chatter of Nambu machine guns mixed with the deeper bark of heavier weapons, creating a wall of lead that forced several boats to veer off course and seek alternative landing sites. Landing craft personnel Lodge 14 took a direct hit from a 75mm gun, positioned in a concrete bunker overlooking Red Beach. The explosion lifted the craft's stern out of the water and sent burning gasoline cascading over the packed soldiers. Private James Mitchell, just 19 years old and participating in his first combat operation, watched in horror as wounded men stumbled over the side into the surf, their uniforms on fire and their screams mixing with the sound of continuing gunfire. Despite the casualties, the first wave maintained its momentum. At 05:45 hours, the leading elements of the 6th New Zealand Brigade touched down on Red Beach and began fighting their way across the narrow strip of sand separating them from the jungle. The Japanese had prepared their defenses in depth, with interconnected firing positions that allowed them to pour devastating crossfire into the landing zones while remaining largely invisible to the attacking forces. Company B of the 23rd Battalion found itself pinned down within 50 yards of the waterline, unable to advance across an open area the Japanese machine gunners had turned into a killing field. Captain David Morrison, the company commander, realized that conventional frontal assault tactics would result in prohibitive casualties. Instead, he divided his force into small teams and began working around the flanks of the enemy positions, using the dense vegetation and coral outcroppings for concealment. The battle for the beaches continued throughout the morning as successive waves of landing craft delivered reinforcements and supplies to the expanding beachhead. By 0800 hours, approximately 2,000 Allied troops had landed on Mono Island, but their advance inland had been limited to a narrow perimeter, extending no more than 300 yards from the water's edge. The Japanese defenders were proving that even a relatively small garrison, properly positioned and well supplied, could exact a terrible price from attacking forces. By mid-morning on October 27th, the temperature on Mono Island had climbed to a suffocating 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity made every breath feel like drowning in warm soup. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Patterson led the 24th Battalion through what the maps optimistically labeled as light jungle, but which reality revealed to be an impenetrable maze of twisted vines, razor-sharp coral outcroppings, and vegetation so dense that visibility rarely extended beyond 10 yards. The Japanese defenders had spent months preparing their positions, with a meticulous attention to detail that characterized their military engineering. Throughout the Pacific, every trail had been blocked with cunningly concealed obstacles. Every clearing had been turned into an interlocking field of fire, and every natural defensive position had been improved, with concrete, steel, and carefully placed explosives designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. Patterson's advance platoon, led by 2nd Lieutenant Robert Sterling, discovered the first major defensive complex at approximately 0930 hours. What appeared from a distance to be nothing more than a slight rise in the ground revealed itself, upon closer inspection, to be an elaborately camouflaged bunker system with firing ports oriented to cover multiple approaches. The bunker's main armament consisted of a 75mm gun capable of engaging both land and naval targets, supported by 3 machine gun positions and a mortar pit. The initial assault on the position resulted in 8 casualties before Sterling realized that a direct approach would be suicidal. The Japanese had constructed their defenses to take advantage of the coral terrain, which provided natural obstacles and channeled attacking forces into narrow approaches, where they could be engaged by concentrated fire. Sterling ordered his men to withdraw to cover positions, while he called for naval gunfire support from the destroyers offshore. According to combat records preserved in the United States Marine Corps Historical Center, similar defensive complexes were encountered throughout the Pacific theater, representing an evolution in Japanese defensive doctrine that emphasized depth, concealment, and maximum utilization of terrain advantages. The first naval gunfire mission against the inland bunker complex began at 10:15 hours, with the destroyer USS Converse delivering 20 rounds of 5-inch high explosive shells, based on coordinates provided by Sterling's forward observers. The barrage succeeded in destroying the concrete overhead cover of the main bunker, but the Japanese garrison remained operational and continued to engage any Allied troops who attempted to advance across the open ground surrounding their position. Sergeant Thomas Wilson, a demolition specialist with extensive experience from earlier Pacific campaigns, volunteered to lead a 4-man team around the left flank of the position, under cover of a diversionary attack from the front. Wilson's team spent hours crawling through nearly impenetrable undergrowth, guided only by compass bearings and the sound of enemy fire, before reaching a position from which they could observe the rear entrance to the bunker complex. The assault on the bunker began at 1300 hours, with a coordinated attack from 3 directions. Sterling's main force provided suppressive fire from the front, while Wilson's demolition team approached from the rear, and a third group under Corporal James Mackenzie moved against the left flank. The action lasted 17 minutes and resulted in the complete destruction of the defensive position, but at a cost of 12 Allied casualties and the consumption of precious ammunition and explosives that would be desperately needed for subsequent operations. As the afternoon progressed, the pattern established at the first bunker complex repeated itself across the breadth of Mono Island. Each Japanese defensive positions had to be individually located, isolated, and destroyed through careful coordination of infantry, naval gunfire, and demolitions. The defenders fought with the fanatical determination that had characterized Japanese resistance throughout the Pacific War, refusing to surrender even when their positions became untenable. By 1600 hours, the Allied forces had advanced approximately 800 yards inland from Red Beach, but their progress had been measured in individual bunkers and machine gun nests rather than in the rapid territorial gains that characterized successful amphibious operations. The jungle seemed to swallow entire companies of soldiers, who would disappear into the green hell of vegetation and coral only to emerge hours later, depleted by casualties and exhausted by the constant strain of close-quarters combat. The heat and humidity were taking an almost equal toll with enemy action. Medical corpsmen reported increasing numbers of heat exhaustion cases, as soldiers struggled with the combined effects of tropical climate, heavy equipment loads, and the physical demands of fighting through terrain that seemed designed to favor the defenders. Water consumption exceeded all planning estimates, and supply parties struggled to maintain adequate logistics support for the advancing infantry. While the battle for Mono Island raged through its second day, preparations for the assault on Sterling Island reached their final stages aboard the ships of Task Force 39. Rear Admiral Theodore Wilkinson had originally planned to delay the Sterling operation until Mono had been completely secured, but intelligence reports indicated that Japanese reinforcements might be en route from Bougainville, making speed essential to the overall success of Operation Good Time. The 8th New Zealand Brigade, under the command of Brigadier Ronald Mackenzie, would spearhead the Sterling assault with support from elements of the United States Marine Corps' 3rd Amphibious Corps. Sterling presented a different tactical challenge than its larger companion island, with steeper beaches, denser jungle, and what aerial reconnaissance suggested was an even more sophisticated defensive system built around a series of interconnected cave complexes. At dawn on October 28th, the pre-landing bombardment of Sterling began with a concentration of fire that exceeded even the previous day's barrage against Mono. 6 destroyers and 3 cruisers participated in the 40-minute preparation, delivering over 1,500 rounds of naval gunfire against suspected enemy positions. The bombardment was supplemented by strikes from Marine Corps dive bombers operating from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, adding the precision of aerial attack to the area destruction capability of naval guns. Captain Yoshiaki Ito, the Japanese commander responsible for both Treasury Islands, had positioned his strongest defensive positions on Sterling, recognizing that the smaller island's terrain features provided natural advantages that could multiply the effectiveness of his limited garrison. The cave complexes had been connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to move between positions without exposure to a live fire, while carefully sited observation posts provided early warning of approaching landing craft. The first wave of the Sterling assault touched down on Green Beach at 0600 hours, with Companies A and B of the 26th Battalion leading the attack. Unlike the previous day's landing on Mono, the initial assault encountered relatively light resistance, suggesting that the bombardment had been more effective or that the Japanese were employing different defensive tactics. Major Harold Richardson, commanding the leading company, quickly established a beachhead and began advancing inland toward the first ridge line that dominated the southern approach to the island's interior. The apparent ease of the initial landing created a sense of optimism that proved to be dangerously premature when the advancing troops encountered the outer edge of the main defensive system. At approximately 0730 hours, historical records maintained by the New Zealand National Archives document the complexity of the defensive works discovered on Sterling Island, which represented some of the most sophisticated field fortifications encountered during the Solomon Islands campaign. The Japanese had constructed their main line of resistance along a coral ridge that provided commanding views of all possible landing sites while offering natural protection against naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. The individual positions were connected by communication trenches and tunnels that had been carved directly into the coral substrate, creating a defensive network that could continue functioning even if individual elements were isolated or destroyed. Richardson's company encountered the first major resistance when they attempted to advance beyond a small clearing that the Japanese had prepared as a killing field. Machine gun fire from concealed positions along the ridge line swept the open ground, making movement impossible during daylight hours. 3 separate attempts to cross the clearing resulted in 24 casualties before Richardson ordered his men to seek alternative routes of advance. The battle for Sterling Island quickly developed into a series of individual actions as companies and platoons found themselves isolated by the terrain and forced to deal with enemy positions that seemed to appear and disappear like ghosts in the jungle. The interconnected nature of the Japanese defenses meant that positions, which appeared to have been neutralized, would suddenly spring back to life as defenders moved through the tunnel system to reoccupy abandoned firing points. Sergeant David Thompson, a section leader with extensive experience from the North African campaign, found himself leading 12 men against a cave complex that controlled access to the island's central ridge. The position appeared to be defended by approximately 20 Japanese soldiers, armed with machine guns, mortars, and what appeared to be a small anti-tank gun that had been positioned to engage landing craft in the offshore waters. Thompson's attack on the cave complex began at 1400 hours with a careful reconnaissance that revealed 3 separate entrances connected by what appeared to be an extensive tunnel system. The main entrance was protected by a machine gun position that commanded the only practical approach, while the secondary entrances were covered by rifle positions that could deliver flanking fire against any attacking force. The assault required coordination between Thompson's section, a mortar team from battalion headquarters, and naval gunfire from the destroyer USS Stack. The operation lasted 3 hours and resulted in the complete destruction of the defensive position, but demonstrated the time and resources required to neutralize even relatively small Japanese strong points in the difficult terrain of the Treasury Islands. The morning of October 29th brought a fundamental change in Allied tactics, as commanders on both islands recognized that conventional infantry assaults against prepared positions were producing casualties far in excess of territorial gains. Colonel Robertson, now serving as the senior ground commander for the Mono Island operations, requested immediate reinforcement with specialized equipment including flamethrowers, demolition charges, and additional mortar support. The stalemate that had developed on both islands reflected the broader challenge facing Allied forces throughout the Pacific theater, where Japanese defenders had learned to maximize the defensive advantages offered by tropical terrain and coral formations. Traditional infantry tactics, developed for European warfare, proved inadequate against opponents who were willing to fight to the death from positions that had been months in preparation. Major General Barrowclough, commanding the overall operation from his flagship, authorized the deployment of specialized assault teams equipped with flamethrowers and explosive charges specifically designed for bunker destruction. These teams, drawn from engineering units and trained in the techniques developed during earlier Pacific operations, represented the evolution of American and New Zealand tactical doctrine in response to Japanese defensive innovations. The first employment of the new tactics came on Mono Island, where Captain Morrison's company had been stalled for 2 days in front of a bunker complex that controlled access to the island's primary ridge line. The position consisted of 3 interconnected concrete bunkers protected by an elaborate system of trenches, wire obstacles, and mines that had been laid with deadly precision across every possible approach route. The operation began before dawn on October 29th with a diversionary bombardment from offshore destroyers, designed to mask the sound of the assault team's approach through the jungle undergrowth. Surrounding the Japanese position, Hayes's team reached the outer perimeter of the bunker complex at 0530 hours, moving with the patience and stealth that characterized successful special operations throughout the Pacific War. Each member of the team carried specialized equipment designed for close-quarters combat against fortified positions, including flamethrowers with extended range capability and explosive charges that could penetrate concrete and coral construction. According to technical reports filed with the United States Army Corps of Engineers, the flamethrower tactics employed at the Treasury Islands represented significant improvements over earlier equipment and techniques. Incorporating lessons learned from previous Pacific operations, the assault on the bunker complex began with the simultaneous employment of the flamethrowers against the main entrance, creating a wall of fire that prevented the Japanese defenders from manning their primary weapons positions. While the flamethrower teams maintained suppressive fire, Hayes and the other specialists approached the bunker from the rear and placed shaped charges against the concrete walls at points where structural analysis indicated maximum vulnerability. The explosion of the demolition charges at 0645 hours marked the beginning of the end for organized Japanese resistance on Mono Island. The destruction of the central bunker complex eliminated the key position that had coordinated defensive fire across the southern half of the island, allowing Allied infantry to advance against individual positions that could no longer provide mutual support. The psychological impact of the flame weapons proved as important as their physical effects, as Japanese defenders began abandoning positions that had previously been considered impregnable. By mid-afternoon on October 29th, the momentum of battle had shifted decisively in favor of the Allied forces, but the coordinated defense that had made the operation so costly was rapidly disintegrating. The final phase of the battle began at 1600 hours with a coordinated advance by all Allied units on both islands. The objective was to reach the northern shores before nightfall, preventing any possibility of Japanese reinforcement or evacuation. The advance encountered scattered resistance from individual positions, but the systematic destruction of the main defensive complexes had eliminated the ability of the defenders to coordinate effective resistance. Captain Ito, the Japanese commander, was killed at 1730 hours while attempting to organize a final defensive line along Sterling Island's northern beach. His death effectively ended organized resistance, although individual soldiers and small groups continued fighting until the final Japanese position was eliminated on the morning of October 30th. The breakthrough on October 29th demonstrated the importance of tactical innovation and specialized equipment in overcoming determined defensive positions in difficult terrain, lessons that would prove invaluable during subsequent Pacific operations. The dawn of October 30th, 1943, revealed the true cost of Operation Good Time as medical corpsmen and burial details worked their way across both Treasury Islands, counting the price paid for strategic advantage in the Solomon Sea. The morning mist rising from the jungle floor carried the acrid smell of curdite, burning vegetation, and death that had become the signature of Pacific warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson stood on the northern beach of Mono Island, watching supply barges discharge the equipment that would transform these blood-soaked coral atolls into advanced bases for the next phase of Allied operations against Rabaul. Behind him, engineers were already surveying sites for radar installations, fuel dumps, and an airstrip that would allow Allied fighters to extend their range deeper into Japanese-held territory. The final tally of Japanese resistance had been eliminated at 0815 hours when a combined team of New Zealand infantry and Marine Corps engineers cleared the last defended cave on Sterling Island. The position had been occupied by 7 Japanese soldiers who fought with the fanatical determination that characterized their nation's military culture, refusing surrender even when their situation became hopeless. Captain Morrison, whose company had spearheaded much of the fighting on Mono Island, compiled the initial casualty reports that would eventually find their way into official histories of the Pacific War. The Allied forces had suffered 214 casualties during the 4-day operation, including 43 killed in action and 171 wounded. The Japanese garrison had been completely eliminated, with an estimated 320 defenders killed and only the prisoners taken, both of whom had been wounded and unconscious when captured. The strategic value of the Treasury Islands would become apparent in the weeks following their capture, as Allied engineers transformed them into advanced bases that extended the range of both air and naval operations against Japanese positions throughout the Central Solomons. The radar installations constructed on the captured islands provided early warning coverage that proved invaluable during subsequent operations, while the anchorages created in the protected waters between Mono and Sterling became staging areas for the forces that would eventually assault Bougainville. Medical Officer Major David Richardson, responsible for casualty treatment during the operation, filed reports that documented the specific challenges of providing medical care during tropical combat operations. The combination of high temperatures, extreme humidity, and difficult terrain had complicated the evacuation and treatment of wounded personnel, while the necessity of fighting from individual positions had made it difficult to establish centralized aid stations. Historical analysis conducted by the United States Marine Corps Historical Division emphasizes the significance of the Treasury Islands operation as a testing ground for the tactics and equipment that would characterize later Pacific amphibious assaults. The lessons learned during Operation Good Time extended beyond purely military considerations to encompass the broader challenges of coalition warfare in the Pacific theater. The successful cooperation between New Zealand and American forces demonstrated the potential for effective combined operations, while highlighting the importance of unified command structures and compatible communications. Equipment. Brigadier Mackenzie, commanding the 8th New Zealand Brigade, noted in his post-operation report that the Treasury Islands campaign had provided invaluable experience in the coordination of naval gunfire, close air support, and infantry operations under combat conditions. The techniques developed during the 4-day battle would be refined and employed during subsequent operations, contributing to the increasing effectiveness of Allied amphibious warfare capabilities. The intelligence gathered during and after the battle revealed the sophistication of Japanese defensive preparations throughout the Central Solomons, information that would prove crucial during the planning for larger operations against Bougainville and eventually Rabaul itself. The detailed examination of captured defensive positions provided insights into Japanese engineering techniques and tactical doctrine that influenced Allied planning for subsequent campaigns. Engineers working on the post-battle cleanup discovered an extensive tunnel system on Sterling Island that had not been detected during the fighting, illustrating the thoroughness of Japanese defensive preparations and the challenges facing Allied forces throughout the Pacific War. The tunnels had been equipped with ventilation systems, supply storage areas, and communication facilities that would have allowed the garrison to continue resistance for weeks. Under favorable circumstances, the transformation of the Treasury Islands from Japanese defensive positions to Allied forward bases began within hours of the final Japanese surrender, as construction equipment and engineering personnel arrived to begin the process of converting the captured territory into launching points for future operations. The speed of this transformation demonstrated the increasing efficiency of Allied logistics and engineering capabilities as the Pacific War entered its decisive phase. 6 months after the last shots were fired on the Treasury Islands, the strategic importance of Operation Good Time had become unmistakably clear to military planners. Throughout the Pacific theater, the captured islands had been transformed into a complex of radar stations, fuel depots, and anchorages that extended Allied operational range by 300 miles, bringing the massive Japanese fortress at Rabaul within effective striking distance of land-based aircraft and naval forces. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific area, included specific reference to the Treasury Islands operation in his post-war memoirs, noting that the capture of Mono and Sterling had been essential to the success of subsequent operations against Bougainville and the eventual neutralization of Rabaul. The strategic vision that had identified these small coral atolls as crucial stepping stones had been vindicated by events, though at a cost that reminded all participants of the price demanded by victory in the Pacific War. The lessons learned during the 4-day battle had immediate application in subsequent amphibious operations throughout the Pacific theater. The specialized tactics developed for bunker destruction were refined and standardized, eventually becoming part of the standard training curriculum for assault troops preparing for operations against fortified Japanese positions. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, who had observed the initial landings from the bridge of USS Converse, was promoted to full commander and assigned to the staff responsible for planning the Bougainville invasion. His experience during Operation Good Time contributed to the development of improved coordination procedures between naval gunfire support ships and assault forces, innovations that reduced casualties during subsequent amphibious operations. The individual stories of courage and sacrifice that characterized the Treasury Islands battle became part of the broader narrative of Allied victory in the Pacific War. Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes, the demolition specialist whose flamethrower tactics had broken the deadlock on Mono Island, was awarded the Silver Star for his actions during the bunker assault. His citation noted that his innovative employment of specialized weapons under combat conditions had contributed significantly to the overall success of the operation. Major Harold Richardson, who had commanded the assault on Sterling Island, returned to New Zealand after the war and eventually wrote a detailed memoir of his Pacific service that included extensive coverage of the Treasury Islands operation. His account, published in 1957, provided insights into the personal experience of combat leadership during amphibious operations that influenced military training programs for decades. According to records maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the Allied soldiers who died during Operation Good Time were buried in military cemeteries on both Mono and Sterling Islands, where their graves were maintained by local communities until the remains could be repatriated to their home countries following the end of the war. The Japanese defenders who died during the battle were buried with military honors by Allied forces, reflecting the respect that had developed between opponents who had fought with mutual courage and determination. Captain Yoshiaki Ito, the Japanese commander, was buried in a separate grave marked with a simple wooden cross that bore his name and rank in both English and Japanese characters. The Treasury Islands today remain largely uninhabited, their jungle-covered surfaces showing few visible signs of the intense fighting that once raged across their coral terrain. Occasional visitors, usually military historians or Pacific War veterans, can still locate some of the concrete bunkers and tunnel entrances that characterize Japanese defensive positions, though most have been reclaimed by the tropical vegetation that quickly covers all human construction in the Solomon Islands climate. The strategic significance of Operation Good Time extended far beyond its immediate tactical objectives, contributing to the broader Allied strategy of isolating and neutralizing Japanese strongholds throughout the Pacific theater. The capture of the Treasury Islands represented one link in the chain of operations that eventually led to the complete collapse of Japanese defensive positions in the Central Solomons and the neutralization of Rabaul as an effective military base. The courage displayed by soldiers of both sides during the Treasury Islands battle exemplified the broader character of Pacific War combat, where small units fighting in isolation often determine the outcome of strategic operations through their individual actions under extreme conditions. The legacy of Operation Good Time lies not only in its strategic consequences, but in its demonstration of the human qualities that ultimately determine victory in the Pacific theater: courage, determination, and the willingness to sacrifice for objectives larger than individual survival.